Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in 1869 Arkansas, the sinister tale of the sisters who lured travelers to their doom. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The year is 1869. A few years after the turmoil of the Civil War, in a rural stretch of Arkansas scarcely touched by rebuilt roads or steady law enforcement. The land there is wooded, broken by dirt paths and isolated homesteads. In this hidden corner of a county far from the state capital, two sisters, Amelia and Josephine Harrow, arrived late one autumn evening. The air smelled of damp earth, and twilight lingered longer than it ought to. They had taken over a modest inn at the crossroads, a house once run by traveling merchants. Local records held little about them. Most of what remains comes from a few county ledger entries and rumor in nearby town meetings. The Harrow name appeared in a single property deed recorded in 1868, naming a J. Harrow sisters as new proprietors of the old Stone Mill Inn. Before that, the property belonged to a Mr. Caldwell, whose sudden death in 1865 was glossed over in local papers as mysterious complications. Locals described the sisters as pale, quiet, and exceptionally private. They wore plain black dresses, rarely ventured into town, and had a stern reputation. One neighbor told a traveling salesman that he once stopped by their door and heard soft sobbing within, though when he knocked, no one answered. The inn sign read simply Harrow House, and travelers noted the lack of a lantern or welcoming beam at night. The region itself was still recovering from the Reconstruction era, its social and economic fabric frayed. State records from that period, especially, lie in the years 1861 through 1874, reveal a land torn between memory and rebuilding, and law enforcement was often overstretched in remote counties. Encyclopedia of Arkansas. Though this was not a war story, the unsettled climate of post-war Arkansas fed whispered superstition and suspicion. The sisters claimed they only offered a bed and simple meals to weary travelers. But a few passers-by noted odd details: quiet corridors, locked doors at odd hours, and guests that arrived but never left. By the winter of 1870, the Harrow House had acquired an uncanny silence. No advertisements, no chatter at the mercantile, yet someone always seemed to be staying there. A constable's logbook from Fayette County notes occasional disappearances of transient men, though no link was established. Most travelers then were railway workers or traders moving south toward the Louisiana line, men without kin nearby to file reports. A schoolteacher named Ellen McCord later testified that she had seen one such traveler, a tanner by trade named Mr. M. Ridley, take supper with the Harrow sisters. She remembered his laugh, the bright shine of his boots, and how he tipped his hat to her outside the inn. He was gone by morning, she said, and so was his horse. The sisters told townsfolk he had paid and departed before dawn. His saddle, however, was found weeks later downstream, half buried in silt. The story might have faded into gossip, if not for a visiting doctor from Little Rock, Dr. Thomas Redden, who stopped there one rainy night. He later mentioned the sisters' unusual calm, like mourners who had forgotten their dead, as he wrote in a private journal fragment. He described the faint smell of iron in the kitchen and the quiet clinking of porcelain in the next room. In shaping the broader picture of these years, historians like those who chronicled Lavinia Burnett's 1845 case, Arkansas's earliest recorded female execution, give us valuable context. Burnett's trial revealed the harsh scrutiny faced by women accused of crime in frontier society. The Harrow sisters would one day be whispered of in the same breath, though no trial ever reached a courthouse. Their story lived in rumor, in second-hand confession, and in the soft scratch of names erased from lodging ledgers. By 1871, reports multiplied. Farmhands claimed they saw fresh soil mounded behind the inn, then 10 days later. A trapper swore he saw Amelia hauling a wooden crate to the riverbank at dusk. Constable Gray of Boone County sent a letter noting odd movements of 2 female proprietors. Avoid contact until warrant proper, but that warrant never came. When spring thawed the roads, a small group of townsmen ventured out, saying they'd simply check on the ladies. They returned pale and tight-lipped. The inn, they said, was locked. Through the back window, one man claimed to see rows of cups and saucers arranged perfectly, but the sisters were gone. No record confirms how soon after that the Harrow House burned, only that by 1872 the site was marked abandoned and unsafe. Locals told of travelers hearing footsteps or voices near the ruined porch. Others said the land was cursed, that even livestock refused to graze near the blackened soil. When the county clerk's office reopened after the spring floods of 1873, one new entry appeared in the ledger: a transfer of the burned inn's property to a local sheriff's deputy named Horace Keene. It was Keene who later unearthed the most chilling clue: a small leather-bound notebook sealed in wax, discovered in what had been the cellar. The pages were warped by moisture, but a few lines survived. Most entries were mundane: bread made, visitors at supper, wash linens. Then came one that simply read, 2 more tonight. Keep it quiet for now. The handwriting matched a sample from Josephine Harrow's signature on an earlier property deed, but the ledger itself vanished soon after Keene's death that autumn, reportedly stolen during a burglary at his home. It was never recovered. By this time, the case, if one could call it that, had already grown into a local myth. Newspapers from Little Rock and Helena ran brief columns about the widow innkeepers, drawing faint comparisons to old-world tales from New York's Bender family murders of the early 1870s. The Arkansas Gazette printed a short editorial noting that justice drifts easily in river country. Some surviving accounts mentioned a Caldwell relative, possibly kin of the inn's previous owner, who traveled from Mississippi to reclaim the land but vanished en route. His wagon was later found overturned along the Wachita River, with horses still tethered and alive. Locals took this as a bad sign and stopped speaking of the Harrows altogether, as though silence might keep whatever had happened from spreading. The parallel to Lavinia Burnett surfaced again in frontier legal circles. Her 1845 execution had become a cautionary tale, illustrating how easily rumor hardened into sentence. Scholars and archivists, revisiting such women's cases in the 1870s, began to refer to the Harrow affair as a ghost file, an echo of Burnett's fate without the closure of a gallows. A few travelers' journals from that decade add more unease than clarity. A preacher passing through in 1874 wrote that he saw a woman in black standing in the doorway of the ruin, hands folded, no face discernible. Another, a Union veteran turned peddler, claimed he spent one night nearby and woke to the sound of cups rattling, though no one was there. County surveyors recorded the ground as unstable and advised avoiding construction. The inn's timbers, charred but upright, were eventually dismantled for scrap by 1880. Yet by then, a new rumor stirred, that the sisters had been sighted in northern Louisiana, running a modest tea house under assumed names. In the faded archives of Jefferson County, a letter dated 1881 bears a faint wax seal and the initials J.H. It was addressed to a Mr. Roland Sykes, a merchant known for purchasing properties left ownerless after fires or deaths. The message contained only a few lines. "We are well. The river keeps our secrets. The tea is stronger now." No one ever proved that the note came from Josephine Harrow, but handwriting experts of the time remarked on its graceful loops and uncanny similarity to her known correspondence. Sheriff's Deputy Horace Keene's widow later told reporters that her husband had been troubled by dreams in the weeks before his death, dreams of a cellar that breathed like lungs. She insisted he planned to reopen the investigation, but on the night before he was to visit Little Rock, he fell suddenly ill and died within hours. The attending physician listed severe gastrointestinal distress. Some muttered about poison. Through the 1880s, the story persisted as whisper more than report. Locals avoided the area where Harrow House once stood. Travelers who camped nearby spoke of soft footsteps on gravel and of hearing the clink of china. A journalist from the Memphis Appeal came in 1884 to write a feature on haunted Arkansas, but after 3 nights near the ruins, he left abruptly, publishing only a single paragraph. The air is too still there, as if listening for something unsaid. In later court documents and recollections, parallels again surfaced with Lavinia Burnett's historical record, not because of direct kinship or influence, but because Arkansas lawmen of the era still remembered her trial as the benchmark for judging women accused of murder. One circuit judge even remarked, "If the Harrow sisters be guilty, their ghost walks freer than Burnett ever did." The Burnett case, mentioned often in legal digests of the 1870s and 1880s, served as a grim reminder that the law's reach in the backcountry often stopped where the road did. By 1887, travelers passing through said the site had been swallowed by vines and briars. Only the stone foundation remained, moss-covered and half-sunk. A young boy gathering berries reportedly fell into what he thought was a hollow in the ground and landed among splintered boards, remnants of the cellar. When pulled out, he kept repeating that he'd seen a shelf with empty cups. The townsfolk filled the hole with earth the next day. In the final years of the century, a new generation grew up barely recalling the Harrows at all. Yet, during harvest festivals, older residents sometimes told a story after dark, of 2 women who welcomed strangers and served them tea that never cooled. Some listeners swore that if one traveled along the old trade road at night, a single light still glowed where the inn once stood. By the turn of 1890, the Harrow story had faded from official talk, surviving mostly in letters between aging lawmen and amateur chroniclers. One such correspondent was Professor Edwin Latner, a historian at the fledgling University of Arkansas, who sought to document regional moral folklore for his students. In a surviving lecture transcript, Latner wrote, "Every county holds a secret that prefers the grave to the gallows." He used the Harrow account as an example of how the frontier blurred the lines between rumor and record. Latner cross-referenced the Lavinia Burnett case in his research, calling it the earliest shadow cast on Arkansas womanhood by suspicion of deliberate murder. His comparison was methodical, not sensational. Both tales, he noted, shared the theme of isolation and the slow erosion of law in the rural South. When the lecture was later reprinted in a small academic circular, locals objected to having the Harrows named again, fearing it would wake ghosts best left sleeping. That same year, an itinerant photographer named Marcus Penn traveled through Boone County with a wagon camera. He captured a series of plates of abandoned properties, one of which bore a barely legible sign, Harrow House, 1868. The photograph shows 2 collapsed chimneys, a tangle of vines, and a porcelain cup balanced improbably on a beam. Penn sold his prints to newspapers, but this one was deemed too unsettling for general display. The negative was said to have cracked in storage after exposure to damp air. In 1892, the land was quietly purchased by a timber company headquartered in Hot Springs. Workers sent to clear the area returned uneasy. Their foreman, Jeb Carter, claimed that even after the brush was burned, the air smelled faintly of brewed leaves and rust. One man refused to continue when he unearthed fragments of crockery from the soil. The company ceased operations there, citing drainage concerns, but privately referred to the location as the Hollow Lot. For a few years, peace settled over the ruins. Then, a traveling preacher passing through Harrison spoke in his sermon of sisters who fed travelers more than bread, describing it as a parable of temptation. Listeners realized he had somehow learned details never printed publicly: the cellar, the missing travelers, even the cups. When questioned, he said only that old roads remember the weight of their guests. By 1895, the inn's story was retold to amuse children and warn drifters, stripped of names but not of dread. Yet the air around the old site seemed to resist settlement. Surveyors tried again to build a road nearby. Every attempt washed out in rain or river swell. Locals whispered that the ground would never take kindly to strangers. In 1897, a visiting folklorist from Louisiana, Clara M. Thane, arrived in the region seeking to collect what she called survivor songs, old ballads about misfortune and crime. Her notes, preserved today in a university archive, describe an elderly woman named Martha Greeley, who claimed to have known the Harrow sisters in her youth. Greeley told Thane, "They weren't cruel, just quiet. Something had broken in them long before the tea turned bitter." Thane's field journal records the rhythm of rural speech and superstition. One farmer told her that the sisters' land drank sorrow like water. Another whispered that, if you dig deep enough under that ground, the air comes out cold. These remarks were not confessions, merely echoes, fragments of a story retold by those who had outlived its beginning. A brief mention in the Arkansas Gazette, dated April 1898, noted that excavation work near the former Harrow property unearthed a scatter of personal effects, a ring, bits of cloth, and several small jars. No follow-up article appeared. Some researchers later suggested that these finds were planted by scavengers to feed the folklore market that blossomed in those years, when penny papers thrived on rural ghost tales. Still, among historians, the Harrow story persisted as a cautionary note about how thinly law stretched across the post-war South. In reviewing frontier-era jurisprudence, legal scholars again cited Lavinia Burnett, whose 1845 execution had become a touchstone in discussions of women's culpability. Her name appeared twice in Thane's lecture notes, where she drew a parallel. The Harrows escaped rope and record alike, yet their legend hangs heavier than Burnett's verdict. By 1900, the timber company had abandoned all claims to the property. The site was labeled unsuitable for development. A new railway spur cut north of the river, diverting traffic. Ice away, and the road leading to the Harrow ruins was left to decay. When Clara Thane returned a decade later, she found only foundation stones and what she described as the ghost of a chimney. Local memory faded, but curiosity lingered. A traveling painter from Tennessee stopped by in 1903 and painted a moody landscape titled The Sisters' Hollow. The work shows two dim figures at a table under a skeletal tree, steam rising faintly from cups that reflect no light. The painting was exhibited once in Little Rock, then disappeared. By the early 1900s, the tale had crossed from report into folklore, becoming part of the region's oral history. Some said the sisters moved east and died under assumed names. Others claimed they had drowned themselves rather than face exposure. Yet on certain quiet nights, travelers on the old county road said they still saw a lamp flicker near the bend, just where Harrow House once stood. As the new century unfolded, the name Harrow appeared less often in print and more in whispers exchanged at crossroads or around potbelly stoves. In 1905, a journalist named Samuel Holbrook attempted to rekindle public interest with a serialized feature titled Arkansas Mysteries of the Reconstruction. He spent several months traveling through the northern counties, tracing accounts of unsolved disappearances from the 1860s and 1870s. The Harrow case became his centerpiece, though by then nearly all witnesses had passed away. Holbrook's surviving drafts describe his arrival at the old site. The ground sinks slightly, as though breathing underfoot. A few stones remain, cold, even at noon. The locals avoid my gaze when I ask of the sisters. He reported finding fragments of crockery, blackened by fire, and a single rusted key lodged in the soil. His tone was measured, almost scientific, but one could sense a restrained unease in his phrasing. During his research, Holbrook corresponded with Professor Edwin Latner, then near retirement. Latner wrote, "It is curious how these women reappear in the record whenever the state reviews its past. Much as Lavinia Burnett remains a reference point for the judiciary, the Harrows haunt the conscience of those who document them." Latner's note again tethered the mystery to that earlier case, reminding readers how rare it was for women to be associated with deliberate violence in frontier history, rarer still for them to vanish without trace. When Holbrook's first installment ran in the Arkansas Gazette, sales surged. Yet after his second article, he abruptly withdrew the series. Colleagues said he had returned from Boone County visibly shaken. One printer remembered him muttering that the inn was never truly gone, just quieter. Holbrook relocated to Missouri and never wrote on the subject again. In the years that followed, the tale was retold by storytellers at county fairs. Some embellished it into melodrama, others preserved the austere, factual tone. The names Amelia and Josephine became archetypes in Ozark folklore, twin figures of caution and curiosity, standing somewhere between guilt and ghostliness. By 1908, a new generation scarcely believed the Harrows had ever existed. The inn's remains were finally cleared by railroad surveyors extending telegraph lines through the valley. Workers found a shallow depression where the cellar once lay and a faint scent of ash that clung to their tools. One laborer wrote to his wife, "It feels wrong here. Even the mules won't stay tethered long." Still, on the maps of that period, the area retained a curious label. Harrow Hollow, site of former inn, 1868-1872. Cartographers often copied the note from older surveys without knowing why. It became an accidental memorial, an unspoken acknowledgement that something once lived there which the land itself could not quite forget. By 1910, Arkansas had changed. Railroads stretched farther, towns bustled with new trade, and the frontier quiet of the Reconstruction years had faded. Yet, in that transformation, Harrow Hollow lingered like an unresolved paragraph at the edge of progress. The old wagon road that once passed near the inn was now little more than a sunken track lined with cedar and thorn. That same year, a surveyor named Alfred Boone, distant kin to one of the first constables who'd investigated the sisters, was tasked with mapping potential timber routes through the northern counties. His journal, preserved in the state archives, holds a single strange entry. Stopped at the hollow by dusk. Heard water boiling somewhere, though no fire nor camp in sight. The tone is factual, but the detail stands out among pages otherwise filled with angles and measurements. Around this time, a historian from Little Rock, Mary Ellen Sprague, compiled a regional volume titled Women and the Shadows of Justice, 1840 to 1890. She devoted a section to the Lavinia Burnett case, using it to illustrate how frontier law judged character more than evidence. In her footnotes, she briefly referenced the Harrow affair, writing, "The untried specter of these sisters marks the farthest echo of Burnett's precedent, guilt unrecorded, legacy unburied." Her phrasing revived scholarly discussion, though no new facts surfaced. Residents of nearby farms reported that strangers occasionally visited the site, students, journalists, or self-styled spiritualists. One local farmer, Ephraim Doss, recounted that he saw a pair of women in dark clothing there one autumn evening, standing motionless beside the foundation stones. When he approached, they turned toward the woods and were gone before he could call out. He swore they left no tracks in the soft earth. Meanwhile, the timber company that once owned the property, Petion, tried to have it marked as restricted, citing unstable soil and unexplained sinkage. The wording was bureaucratic, yet locals believed it was simply a polite way of saying no one wished to work there. Children were warned not to play in that valley. Hunters avoided setting traps within its boundary, claiming that game fled the moment the air grew still. In a county museum established later that decade, one cracked porcelain cup labeled "Found near Harrow Hollow, seen 1870," was placed in a glass case. Its provenance was uncertain, yet visitors often paused before it longer than any other exhibit. Some said it gave off a faint metallic scent, as though steeped too long in forgotten water. By 1912, the story's final tangible traces seemed to dissolve into local legend. But even then, in letters exchanged between state archivists and amateur historians, the name Harrow surfaced again, an unfinished story in the margins of official memory, where history and haunting became indistinguishable. In the spring of 1913, a new road survey brought engineers and laborers once more to the edge of Harrow Hollow. They arrived not for history but for practicality, to assess whether a bridge could be built across the narrow creek that cut through the valley. Among their team was Thomas Ridley, grandson of the traveler who had vanished there nearly half a century earlier. He claimed to have joined the project out of curiosity, not vengeance, but one of his letters to his wife suggests deeper unease. I feel the ground knows me. It shifts when I walk. The men camped nearby for several nights. One morning, Ridley failed to appear for breakfast. Searchers found his bedroll undisturbed and his boots missing. They scoured the creek bed and the low brush until dusk, uncovering nothing except a half-buried cup handle glinting in the mud. The county coroner later ruled the disappearance unexplained, presumed drowned, though the creek was barely waist-deep. The camp disbanded within a week. This incident briefly revived public interest. A short column appeared in the Arkansas Democrat, connecting Ridley's name to the long-vanished traveler of 1869. The reporter wrote that local superstition recalls the Harrow sisters and their shadowed hospitality. No further follow-up was printed. By then, the nation was turning its attention to new events, modernity, industry, and the world beyond its rural ghosts. Still, whispers persisted. A minister passing through the region later that summer preached a sermon on hidden sins that the soil remembers. Listeners said he paused mid-sentence and stared toward the hollow as if listening for an unseen response. The sermon was never repeated, and he left the parish soon after. In scholarly circles, Mary Ellen Sprague continued her comparative research between the Harrow affair and the case of Lavinia Burnett, presenting at the 1914 Southern Historical Association meeting. Her paper argued that, in both instances, womanhood became the mask for dread, a social mirror through which communities read their own fears. Though she focused on judicial perception, her inclusion of the Harrows drew murmurs from those who felt the tale better suited folklore than academia. Sprague's notes, however, included one cryptic postscript. If there was guilt, it was shared by the land itself. By 1915, Harrow Hollow was formally marked on county maps only as low ground, unstable. Trees had reclaimed much of the clearing. Travelers described a hush there, the kind of stillness that dulls even the sound of birds. Locals who passed on horseback said their mounts grew restless long before the hollow came into view. That same year, a final deed entry transferred the property, now nearly worthless, to the state for back taxes. The clerk who signed it noted in the margin, "No claimants since 1872. Beneath it, someone penciled in faintly, "And none expected." By 1916, Arkansas was moving into a new age. Telephones, electric light, and the quiet spread of automobiles along dusty county roads. Yet for all its progress, Harrow Hollow remained unchanged, untouched, as if time itself had learned to bypass it. The new state maps marked it as uninhabited floodplain, though local travelers continued to give the area a wide berth. A young teacher named Rosemary Kent, newly appointed to a nearby rural school, recorded an unsettling experience in a letter home. She wrote, "I took the short path past the hollow at dusk and thought I saw two women seated by a fallen log. They seemed to be sharing tea, though there was no fire. I blinked, and the spot was empty." Her colleagues dismissed the vision as fatigue, but Kent never used that path again. In the state archives around the same time, a junior historian named Peter Alden began compiling a monograph on unsolved 19th century cases. His notes referenced earlier studies on Lavinia Burnett, identifying her as Arkansas's first reminder that guilt and rumor can be twins. He included the Harrow case as a secondary echo, a story unresolved not for lack of evidence, but for lack of survivors. Alden's draft never saw publication. He left for Europe the next year to serve in the Great War. Meanwhile, elderly residents of Boone County told interviewers that the hollow had grown strangely fertile. "Grass there never dies," said one farmer, "but nothing eats it." Another recounted that on humid nights, the air near the ruins carried the faint scent of steeped tea leaves and iron. These details drifted into local superstition. The Harrow smell, people called it, and by then, few questioned its source. When state officials inspected the land for possible agricultural use in 1917, they recorded soil denser and darker than surrounding areas. One report mentioned a concentration of lime residue and traces of char, suggesting an old fire. The officials spent less than an hour on site before departing, their wagon wheels leaving deep tracks that the next rain quickly erased. By then, 50 years had passed since Amelia and Josephine Harrow first arrived. The last surviving townsfolk who had known them were in their 90s, too frail to be interviewed. What remained were half-remembered names, one burned deed, and the lingering sense that something at Harrow Hollow refused to be fully buried. On the evening of December 23, 1917, a single lantern light was reported by a postal driver passing near the old trade road. He said it hung motionless above the ground, bright against the fog, and when he slowed to look, it vanished. The man told no one but his wife, and years later she repeated it quietly. He saw the sisters still serving, I think, still waiting for travelers. When 1918 dawned, the world's attention turned elsewhere, to war, to influenza, to survival. The rural edges of Arkansas grew quieter still, their histories left to rot with weathered boards and courthouse files. Yet for those who lived near Harrow Hollow, the silence carried an identity of its own. It was no longer a place on a map, but a pause between breaths, a corner of earth that seemed to prefer forgetting. A handful of letters from that year survive in the Boone County Recorder's office, most of them routine notices of land tax adjustments. One stands out. A note from an elderly widow named Mrs. Redden, claiming to be a distant cousin of Dr. Thomas Redden, the physician who had once dined at the Harrow House decades earlier. She wrote that her sleep had been visited by women in black pouring tea over ashes. The letter ends mid-sentence, as though interrupted, and bears no reply. Meanwhile, newspapers in Little Rock ran retrospectives on early Arkansas law, citing the Lavinia Burnett trial as a milestone in the state's judiciary. In a footnote, a journalist briefly mentioned the unclosed affair of the Harrow sisters, calling it the frontier's unsolved whisper. It was the last time their names appeared in print before the century's close. That summer, a flash flood tore through the valley, collapsing the last of the inn's foundation stones. Locals said the earth swallowed what remained: timbers, nails, even the faint line of the old road. When the water receded, the hollow appeared oddly smooth, as if brushed clean by unseen hands. A veteran returning from France, Private Henry Latner, grandson of Professor Edwin Latner, visited the site after reading his grandfather's papers. His diary entry reads, "The ground feels warm. I do not mean from the sun. Something hums under it, low as breath." He camped there one night and left before dawn. His descendant. Nance later found the diary, tucked between maps, its final line underlined twice. They never stopped serving. As the years pressed on, the Hollow's story survived only through fragments: a broken cup displayed in a museum case, a half-remembered sermon, a note in a historian's margin. Yet even in silence, its presence felt active, as if waiting to be spoken aloud again. Those who rode near the valley said their horses snorted and turned away without prompting. By 1919, 50 years had passed since the first disappearance, and the world had changed beyond what Amelia and Josephine could have imagined. Still, every autumn, when mist pooled low over the creek, a faint glimmer was said to rise from the soil, a shimmer like steam from an invisible cup. No one investigated. The locals had learned that curiosity was the first step toward invitation. The post-war decade brought little change to Harrow Hollow. By 1920, the valley had reverted fully to forest. The last county survey simply described the land as dense growth, unsuitable for grazing. Yet, despite the silence, the story refused to die. A few teachers at the Harrison Normal School began using the Harrow case as an example in local history essays, not of crime, but of how rumor could outlive record. One student paper from that period, signed only ER, included a striking line: "Some women vanish from the world, yet the world remembers the shape of their absence." The instructor marked it with a red pencil. Poetic, but perhaps too literal. That same year, Mary Ellen Sprague, now retired but still exchanging letters with fellow historians, revisited her notes on Lavinia Burnett and the Harrow affair. In her correspondence to a colleague in Memphis, she wrote, "The parallels remain haunting. Burnett faced judgment and was executed. The Harrows evaded judgment and became myth. Both, however, endure as if history itself were unwilling to forget its daughters." Her phrasing later appeared in a regional historical review, quietly reintroducing the Harrows to readers who had never heard their names. In late 1921, a team of prospectors exploring the valley for mineral deposits set up camp near the creek. One of them, James Connery, reported that their lanterns kept dimming without explanation. On the third night, they heard what he described as porcelain chiming in the dark, as though dishes were being set on a table. The men broke camp before dawn and never returned. When asked later if he might have imagined it, Connery said, "Maybe, but it sounded polite, like I'd been invited to sit." By 1923, the hollow had once again entered folklore. Travelers spoke of a phantom light that moved along the ridge, or of faint singing carried on fog. One newspap, Air humorist, even wrote a parody ballad, "The Tea House Ghosts of Boone County." Yet behind the mockery lay discomfort, that persistent unease when the past refuses to stay silent. Old residents noticed something else: wild tea plants growing thick near the old road, where none had been known before. Their leaves were darker, their scent sharper, as though steeped in something older than soil. Locals avoided them, saying the brew from those leaves tastes like metal and memory. By the close of the 1920s, few remembered the sisters' names in full. The land was sold for logging again, though the company foreman refused to let crews stay overnight. He simply marked the area restricted, the same word used half a century earlier. Time circled back upon itself, quietly sealing the hollow, but never quite erasing it. By the winter of 1924, the surrounding towns had modernized with paved streets, electric lamps, and new storefronts. Yet, even as progress glimmered in nearby Harrison, no one dared build within a mile of Harrow Hollow. The land's reputation remained too heavy, its silence too deliberate. Locals joked that even the wind avoided it. That year, the Arkansas Historical Quarterly published a modest essay by Peter Alden, now returned from the war and teaching history at a small college in Conway. His article, titled "Unfinished Testimonies of the Frontier," once again drew comparison between the forgotten Harrow case and Lavinia Burnett's documented trial. Alden wrote, "Burnett was judged by her peers. The Harrow sisters were judged by the soil." The phrase caught quiet admiration among scholars, and one reviewer noted how Alden's tone was less legal than elegiac. Following its publication, Alden received a letter from an unnamed correspondent claiming to have found something unusual while clearing brush near the hollow, a half-buried iron kettle containing fragments of porcelain and bone. The man included a sketch, but no return address. Alden reportedly filed the letter away and never mentioned it publicly. By 1926, the county museum curator, Edwin Sykes, attempted to gather what little physical evidence remained: the lone teacup, the photograph of the inn's ruins, and a copy of Alden's essay. He placed them in a single glass case labeled "The Harrow Mystery, 1869 to 1872." Visitors often reported feeling a chill near that corner, though the building was well heated. A few claimed they could smell faint tea, though the display was sealed. Meanwhile, tales of the sisters evolved into local legend. Children were warned, "Don't linger near the hollow at dusk, or you'll be invited to supper." Older residents spoke of a soft humming sound that rose from the valley on mist. "The mornings, like the echo of porcelain striking porcelain." Travelers passing at night sometimes described a glimmer moving between the trees, steady, low, and the color of candlelight seen through glass. In the late 1920s, an out-of-town photographer stopped to capture the hollow's mist for a nature magazine. His assistant recalled that when the flashbulb went off, it illuminated two faint figures on the ridge. The photographer swore he had seen no one there. When the negatives developed, a blurred shape, two silhouettes seated close together, appeared in the background. The editor dismissed it as double exposure, but the photograph was never published. By 1929, the story had slipped from scholarship into folklore completely, kept alive only in the hesitant voices of locals. Yet even those who mocked it hesitated to visit after dark. The land, they said, had learned to guard its own tale, and to retell it only when the air was still enough to listen. As 1930 dawned, the Great Depression swept across Arkansas, shuttering mills and farms alike. Families scavenged for work, and old tales resurfaced as comfort or warning. Among these, Harrow Hollow once more found its place in conversation. The younger folk laughed it off, but the elders still lowered their voices when naming it, as if the hollow itself might overhear. A county reporter, Mildred Parsons, collecting local folklore for a Works Progress Administration project, visited the area in 1931. Her field notebook, now preserved in the state archives, includes a careful transcription of what she called the Twin Widow Tale. The locals she interviewed swore that on nights heavy with fog, one could hear ladies chattering low, like they were setting supper again. Parsons wrote that she felt an odd warmth in the air, as though standing near a hearth, long extinguished. She drew comparisons to Arkansas's first recorded female execution, Lavinia Burnett, remarking that Burnett's guilt had been formally judged, while the Harrow sisters' story lingered in perpetual mistrial. Her notes suggested that, where the court failed to reach, folklore delivered sentence. In this way, the Harrow legend transformed into something larger, a reflection of unfinished justice in post-war America. During her stay, Parsons was guided by an elderly farmer named Hiram Doss, son of the man who had once refused to plow the hollow. Doss led her to what he claimed was the old foundation line. She noted a ridge of stones barely visible under moss. He told her his father used to hear the rattle of cups every time the air turned damp, and that once, while tending livestock nearby, he found hoofprints that began in soft mud and ended abruptly in dry grass. Parsons recorded one final entry before leaving. The earth here is heavy, but alive. The locals treat it as a grave that still breathes. Her WPA supervisor later excluded the Harrow account from publication, deeming it too spectral, too indefinite. Only the handwritten copy survived, quietly filed among other folklore drafts. By 1933, the hollow was again lost to vegetation and neglect. Yet, travelers crossing Boone County sometimes reported a faint glimmer on the road, not the steady glow of a lantern, but a pulse, as if someone moved through fog holding light too low to guide by. One traveler told a roadside clerk that he had seen a table already set beneath the trees. He said it so plainly that the clerk felt cold for hours afterward. The state eventually fenced off the site in 1934, marking it as part of a protected watershed. The official reason was erosion control, but locals knew it was something else, a quiet boundary between what history could measure and what it could only remember. By 1935, the fence around Harrow Hollow had already begun to sag, overtaken by creeping ivy and wild rose. A weathered state sign read, "Protected Area, No Entry," though the nearest residents claimed no ranger ever came to check it. The hollow was content to guard itself. That spring, a geology student from Little Rock College, Henry Callow, received permission to conduct a soil survey there. His academic notes, the last formal documentation before the area's closure, are clinical at first. High iron content, uneven moisture retention, traces of alkaline ash. But a later line, written in the margin, breaks tone entirely. Heard voices beneath the surface, rhythmic, low, like prayer. Callow spent 3 nights camping near the old foundation. On the second night, he recorded temperatures rising several degrees despite cool air. On the third, his lantern burned out twice, and his watch stopped. He left the valley before dawn, abandoning most of his equipment. Years later, he refused to speak of it. The field report ended with one curious note. Soil structure inconsistent with rest of county appears disturbed repeatedly between 1870 and 1900. Meanwhile, newspapers in Harrison began running nostalgic Frontier Tales columns to fill space during the Depression. The Harrow sisters occasionally appeared among them, retold with shifting details, each version more detached from fact. In some, they were portrayed as poisoners, in others as victims of vagrants. One story described them as keepers of a secret supper table for the dead. None claimed certainty, but each ended with the same refrain, that their guests never left. Among the letters to the editor that followed these columns was one from Edwin Sykes, curator of the County Museum. He reminded readers that the case of Lavinia Burnett, executed in 1845, remained the only verified example of a woman's convict planned for murder in early Arkansas. The Harrows, he wrote, occupy the space between record and legend, where guilt has no handwriting. His letter drew polite interest, but no replies. By 1937, the state reclaimed the hollow as part of a conservation effort. Workers sent to clear debris reported finding fragments of porcelain embedded deep in the mud. They buried them again, unwilling to carry them out. When asked if they'd seen anything unusual, one worker simply said, "Felt watched." At dusk, nearby residents sometimes glimpsed faint smoke drifting where no fire had been lit. The scent that followed was always the same, steeped tea and damp wood. People learned to close their shutters when the wind carried that smell, whispering, "The sisters are serving again." By the end of that year, the Harrow Hollow sign had fallen, swallowed by ivy. The place needed no marker. Its story had already taken root in the soil. By 1938, the hollow had become a place spoken of only in quiet tones, its name barely audible in church basements or winter kitchens. Families who'd lived in the county for generations warned newcomers with an uneasy courtesy. Don't take the shortcut through the low ground after sundown. Most laughed, until they noticed how firmly the locals meant it. That summer, a forestry warden named Daniel Merrin reported an odd occurrence. While patrolling the edge of the conservation zone, he saw a small glow between the trees, as though from a lantern swaying gently. Assuming it was trespassers, he followed. The light receded as he approached, then vanished entirely. When Merrin reached the spot, he found only 2 flat stones and what he described as a faint warmth on the air, like breath. He left his patrol log incomplete that night. The final line reads simply, "They're still there." The local paper published a short notice about the incident under the heading, "Forester Spooked by Ghostlight." It was written as humor, but the tone of the article felt uneasy, as if the writer wasn't certain it was a joke. The following week, Merrin resigned his post and moved east. By then, the name Lavinia Burnett was once again appearing in regional histories, her case cited as a measure of frontier justice. Academics began drawing parallels between documented trials and the folk myths that followed them. In one such essay, a scholar from Fayetteville College noted, "If Burnett's gallows marked the state's capacity for punishment, the Harrow sisters' silence marked its failure to remember." It was a quiet nod to the enduring shadow they had cast. Guilt without confession, judgment without proof. Locals who ventured near the hollow during those years spoke of a sound unlike any animal, a soft, repeated clink as if glass or porcelain tapped in rhythm. On still nights, it carried, far, echoing faintly over the creek. A farmer claimed he followed the noise once, but stopped when he smelled something sweet, metallic, and unmistakably familiar, the smell of tea gone bad. In 1939, a traveling evangelist held a revival tent nearby. On the final evening, he told his congregation that the land kept its own Sabbath. He urged no one to visit after dark. A few laughed, but others crossed themselves quietly. When autumn came, the valley fog thickened earlier than usual. Travelers heading toward Harrison swore they saw 2 shadows moving within it, seated close together, heads slightly bowed. They said it looked almost peaceful. No one went closer. Some stories end abruptly, others fade slowly, refusing to be forgotten. The Harrow Hollow belonged to the latter kind, its memory steeped, waiting, never cold. By 1940, few living souls could recall the Harrow sisters firsthand, yet the hollow's legend lingered like the last ember of a dying fire. The land was fully absorbed into the Arkansas Forestry Commission's records, sealed off for ecological preservation. But the paperwork never erased its whispers. Officials referred to it as Parcel 19A, though every forester in Boone County still called it the Hollow. That spring, a government cartographer named Ellen Dwyer was assigned to update maps of the watershed. In her field journal she noted, "Area inaccessible, overgrowth thick, humidity abnormal, air feels charged." A few lines later she added, "Found remains of an old stone wall, perhaps foundation. Heard clinking sound, rhythmic, but no wind." Dwyer was a practical woman. She crossed the entry out in pencil, then rewrote it fainter. "I believe this was the Harrow site." Back in Little Rock, her supervisor dismissed the note as fatigue, yet a clerk who handled the same file later wrote privately that the page smelled faintly of iron and burnt wood. Whether he meant it literally or not is unclear. The file survives today, still labeled with its original classification, unstable soil, no settlement recommended. That same year, the Arkansas State Journal published an article on Lavinia Burnett, whose trial had entered its centennial. The piece closed with a curious reflection. Every justice story in Arkansas begins with Lavinia and ends somewhere near Boone County, where judgment never came. The writer offered no explanation, but older readers understood the reference. Meanwhile, those who farmed along the ridge above the hollow began reporting that their well water sometimes turned cloudy for a few hours after heavy rain, carrying a faint metallic tang. "Like rust and roses," one farmer said. The local paper chalked it up to mineral runoff, but privately, neighbors whispered that the land below was still steeping. On foggy evenings, truck drivers along the main road swore they could see a dim orange light flicker deep among the trees, as if someone were still tending a hearth. One claimed that his headlamps briefly caught two figures near the roadside, both in long black dresses, faces pale, unmoving. He never drove that route again. Records show that by 1941, the Forestry Commission quietly redrew boundaries, excluding the hollow from public access altogether. No one protested. It was as if the entire county agreed that some stories required distance. The war years came, and new shadows replaced old ones. Yet for the few who still remembered, the sister's tale remained a private ritual, told in low voices, by lamp or firelight, over the quiet sound of a spoon turning slowly in a cup. By 1942, the world had grown far beyond the quiet valleys of Arkansas. Radios hummed with war reports, trains rattled through the night, and the people of Boone County had new fears to occupy their minds. Yet even then there were moments, late evenings when the wind died and the fog crept low, when Harrow Hollow seemed to stir again, reminding the land that not every silence meant peace. A forestry patrol that summer recorded a strange observation. Small pockets of heat along creek bed, no visible flame. The entry was stamped and filed without comment. Locals joked that the sisters were boiling supper again, though their laughter came quick and uneasy. An elderly archivist in Little Rock, Mary Ellen Sprague, now nearly 80, wrote one last letter before her passing. It was addressed to a fellow historian and contained a single page of reflection. Lavinia Burnett was given a sentence. The Harrow sisters were given a legend. Yet both endure because Arkansas remembers its women not by their innocence, but by the silence they left behind. Her words captured what decades of gossip and research could not. That absence itself can become history. That autumn, children collecting firewood near the ridge discovered what looked like a teacup handle pressed into the soil. Their parents buried it quietly without reporting it. A week later, smoke rose from the hollow after a thunderstorm, though no fire followed. When a ranger arrived, he found nothing but a patch of damp ground and the faint scent of brewed leaves. As the war raged overseas, the hollow remained untouched, sealed by vines and time. The road that once led to it was reclaimed by trees, its ruts softened by decades of moss. Only the occasional hunter or drifter claimed to hear the faint click of porcelain or the whisper of two voices beyond sight, a soft greeting carried through fog. And so, the store. I close not with justice, nor confession, but with endurance. The Harrow sisters vanished into the same mist that once welcomed travelers to their door. The land, faithful to its memory, kept the rest. Even now, those who pass near that forgotten bend say the air changes. A hush falls, and somewhere in the stillness, the scent of iron and tea lingers just long enough to make you wonder if supper is being served again.